I think it's, one of the most important factors that is facing us today, because ultimately knowledge is power, as they say, and the media is the main purveyor of knowledge, for better or for worse. And especially these days with the internet, it can be like drinking from a fire hose. So, what to understand about every individual outlet, how to read between the lines, how to be able to look at how multiple outlets are covering multiple different stories, knowing what kind of background you need to actually be able to look at any particular story in the right light is critically important if we want to make civic change in society, social change in society. If you're saying you want things to go from worse to better, you have to know how to act, which means you need to know how to use information. And so I think critical media literacy is essential. It's maybe the precondition for us being able to actually make any significant change in our society. And if we're talking about a democracy, small d democracy, let's say it in that way, I think we can't live without it, because if we don't know how to look at information and evaluate it, how can we determine what to do and what can really actually make our lives better? Independent journalism is critically important, because independent journalism is a umbrella that accompanies all sorts of different journalists who are looking to cut against the grain. When we look at big media and the way the media works today, the big brands, the big corporations, obviously big brands, big corporations, big money means very clear entrenched interest behind it. People who oftentimes have a lot of reason why they might want a certain story to come out or be reported a certain way, or are looking to skew the timeline in order to not affect political events. Independent journalism throughout the history of this country in the United States. I mean, you think about, for instance, the abolitionist press, which is really maybe the first big independent journalism enterprise. I mean, all the mainstream press was for slavery, was reporting and using ads of fugitive slaves to make money. And so you had to have an independent alternative source to start to look at how you humanize the African American population in this country, how you put forward the various ills of slavery so people can know. And all throughout time, we've seen it, whether we're talking about the Vietnam War, the Korean War, whether we're talking about the reporters during World War II who were reporting on how big companies were profiteering off of various different war contracts and all the different pieces, whether we're talking right down here to today, when you look at, say, a crisis like East Palestine, where you had the train derail and people were poisoned by the tens of thousands. And it's turned out now that none of this was necessary, that it wasn't scientifically relevant, that the big corporation, train corporation, was lying about what was taking place. That was all independent journalists. So people who basically survive on the basis of you and I, average everyday people, giving them small amounts of money, supporting their small publications, but because of that have the fearlessness and aren't tied down by the same sort of entrenched interests to look at the critical stories, the hard stories, in the way that they have to be looked at, in a way that can actually illuminate what's going on. I think as it concerns what we're seeing in Gaza, for those of us who have been working, independently against the grain, I think one of the things is, one, to take away a lot of the ambiguity that's put forward by the mainstream media. I mean, you have things like the New York Times, when reporting the death toll of those in Gaza, saying the Hamas-run health ministry. And of course, that, brings all sorts of different things to light. So for us as independent and alternative journalists, we point out that, it's not just us who are using these numbers. It's not just the New York Times that prior to this conflict had always used these numbers without any problems. But even the U.S. State Department had been using these numbers for years to determine their policies as it goes. So when we're looking at people who are for Israel, against Israel, these were actually unimpeachable numbers. But because of what took place after October 7th, there were a number of people who didn't want to stand by that and were looking to cast some level of ambiguity despite what the facts may be. So that's like one small case, but I actually consider it absolutely critical, because the number of people who've been killed, I mean, not only do we have to honor each individual life, but it obviously has a huge impact on how people view it from the point of view of public policy. So that's kind of at a granular level, but also the ability to bring forward views and voices from Palestine, to bring in the doctors who were in the hospitals that were being besieged, to have the opportunity to talk to those who are in the streets in a real way. That's something we haven't seen in the mainstream media much at all. I mean, we know there are huge protests going on, but who are these people? Why are they protesting? What are their different views and their different understandings of the problem? Being able to illuminate that perspective, and not just the think tank experts and the former generals and the others that are constantly brought on to comment on the quote unquote Israel-Palestine conflict. So from our point of view, I think it's about both looking at the angles of stories that we're all reporting, bringing out the voices from the ground that are, often difficult to bring because they're coming from a different political and cultural perspective, and also being able to look at, the stories that are being untold about what's taking place there on the ground. I think critical media literacy is the fuel to push people to take prompt action. I mean, when you think what takes someone to lock themselves to other people and block the Golden Gate Bridge and protesting of what's happening in Gaza, what prompts someone to stay up all night printing flyers in order to have a vigil the next day? What is it that gets people to come together in small study groups or a huge mass protest of hundreds of thousands of people? It's the knowledge that not only what is being done in a particular issue is wrong, but also the fact that it's being done in their name, and that there's really no other way that they can change the narrative other than to act. And I think that's the most important thing about critical media literacy, is it turns you into someone with agency. It shows you not only how you can understand the story and what's happening, but how you can understand your particular space and your particular role. And when you can do that, I think it's easier to make a decision to go out and to make change, to do civil disobedience, to march in the street, to hang a flag outside your house. I mean, whatever it may be that you're doing on a political issue that matters to you, I think being able to see how you fit into the specific space, how you are in this political stream and conversation, and if you do X or if you do Y, it can make a difference. But I think that's very hard to do unless you know how to deconstruct and understand the stories, so that you can see, okay, as I look out and look at all these various different things, this is where I am in this, and this is what I can do to change it.